Let's talk about how a single radical idea, sparked by a new translation of an ancient book, literally set a continent on fire. This wasn't just some stuffy church debate. Nope. This was a spark that ignited a revolution, a conflict that spilled onto battlefields and completely redrew the map of the world.
I mean, it sounds kind of crazy when you put it like that, doesn't it? The simple act of translating a book, leading to a war that killed over 100,000 people. How does that even happen? Well, to get it, we've got to go back to the 16th century and look at the one tiny spark that lit this massive, massive fire.
So let's start right there with the spark. And it wasn't a weapon, it wasn't a treaty, it was an idea. A totally radical new answer to a really, really old question: where does ultimate truth and authority actually come from? Okay, to really get the conflict, think of the church's authority back then like a three-legged stool. For centuries, it stood on scripture, yeah, but also on church tradition and the official teachings of the Pope. So the reformers come along, and they just kick away two of those legs. Bam! They argued that the Bible, and the Bible alone, what they called sola scriptura, was the one final supreme authority, period. And this core principle, sola scriptura, scripture alone, it was everything. The sources we looked at describe it as the watchdog of the gospel. What a great phrase, right? Its whole job was to make sure no human institution, no matter how powerful, could mess with the core message. If it wasn't in the Bible, it wasn't the final word. It forced this unavoidable question: was the church the master of the Bible, or was the Bible the master of the church? But hang on, there was a huge problem with this idea. If the Bible is the only authority, what good is that if pretty much nobody can actually read it? At the time, it was all in Latin, the language of priests and scholars. For sola scriptura to be more than just a cool theory for academics, something had to change, big time. And that's where Martin Luther comes into the picture. And just to give you some perspective on how revolutionary this was, you have to understand how totally out of reach the Bible was for a normal person. A couple of decades earlier, in 1489, if you wanted to buy a single printed Bible, in Latin of course, it would have cost you the same as 4 fat oxen. I mean, come on, this was not a book for the people. It was a treasure for the absolute elite. So Luther takes on this absolutely monumental task. He decides to translate the New Testament into German. And not some formal, stuffy, academic German nobody actually spoke. No, he wanted to translate it into a living language that anyone, and I mean anyone, could understand. The goal was simple: get this book into the hands of the common person. And his method for doing this was just brilliant. He didn't lock himself away with a bunch of dictionaries. He went out to the marketplace. He literally listened to how mothers talked to their kids, how butchers and bakers argued and haggled, and he translated the text to sound like that. In doing so, he wasn't just creating a book, he was pretty much forging a new unified German language. And more importantly, he was placing what he called the ultimate source of authority directly into the hands of the people. Okay, so now we have our spark, this revolutionary idea, and a book that anyone can read to see it for themselves. But a spark on its own is pretty harmless, right? It needs fuel. And in 16th century Germany, the fuel was the peasantry. And let me tell you, the social conditions were tinder dry. It is hard for us to really grasp the level of pure contempt the ruling class had for the peasantry. I mean, listen to this. Texts from the time describe them with this stream of insults: villain, rustic, demon, thief. They were seen as basically less than human, just there to be squeezed dry by feudal lords and the church through insane taxes, tithes, and serfdom. But these weren't just some faceless mob of peasants. They were what people at the time called the common man: miners, farmers, city folks who had no vote. And here's the crucial part. This was the exact audience Luther was trying to reach with his Bible and its message of freedom. And wouldn't you know it, when they finally read the Bible in their own language, they didn't just find spiritual comfort. They found a weapon. They drafted this incredible list of demands called the 12 Articles. And just look at what they were asking for: the right to choose their own pastor, fairer taxes, an end to serfdom. All pretty reasonable stuff, right? But the last demand, that was the real bombshell. They said that if any of their demands could be proven to be against Scripture, they'd drop it. They were taking sola scriptura and applying it directly to their lives. And this was the moment. This was when the spark hit the fuel. The princes and the lords, of course, rejected all the demands immediately. And what started as a protest just exploded into a massive, brutal uprising that we now call the German Peasants' War.
This whole rebellion just ripped open a huge crack within the Reformation movement itself. On one side, you had Luther. He was all about spiritual freedom, but he also preached total obedience to earthly rulers. He had this two kingdoms idea, that the heavenly kingdom of your soul was totally separate from the earthly kingdom of government. Rebelling was a sin. But on the other side, you had guys like Thomas Müntzer, a radical preacher who was basically saying, no, the time is now. We need to violently overthrow the wicked and build God's kingdom right here, right now. So Luther, facing this massive revolution that he had, unintentionally inspired, he made a shocking and frankly tragic choice. He sided with the princes. He wrote this absolutely brutal pamphlet telling them to crush the rebellion without a shred of mercy. He unleashed this unbelievable fury against the very common man he had tried so hard to empower. And the result was a slaughter. The peasant armies were just annihilated, and the whole rebellion was drowned in blood. So think about that. A movement that began with a powerful call for freedom ended in a horrifying crackdown fully endorsed by its own founder. The Reformation as a movement was saved, but it came at the terrible cost of the very people who first took its message to heart. And yet, the core questions about authority that it unleashed, they never went away. In fact, they're still being debated right now, today. And what's so fascinating is how these 500-year-old arguments still echo. The challenge to scripture alone today doesn't really come from church tradition anymore. Now it comes from what some are calling sola experientia, the ultimate authority of our own personal experience. The challenge to faith alone isn't about adding good works, it's more about a kind of moralism, the idea that salvation is based on our performance. The core conflicts never really died. They just changed their clothes for the modern world. And all of this leaves us with a final question. It's the exact same one that faced the peasants, the preachers, and the princes 500 years ago. It's a question about where we ground our deepest beliefs. What's your final court of appeal? Is it a sacred text, a trusted institution, or is it the landscape of your own inner life? The answer you choose, as history shows us, can have truly revolutionary consequences.